All right. Looks like we're live. I love the production value of that intro, the lead in. Thanks, Blake, for that. So, for everyone tuning in, I'd like to welcome you all for our discussion today. And Justin, welcome to you.
Thanks.
I think most people listening are probably familiar with you. Hopefully, they've read your article that you've posted on DZone. So, yeah, before we get started, I guess I'll say we're just going to we're going to kind of jump in and discuss a topic that I think is pretty salient, but it's a touchy subject. There's lots of different ways to look at the subject, and so we are going to encourage people listening to partake in a Q&A towards the end. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, and we'll try to get to them towards the end. So to kick off, Justin, I was thinking a good way to kick off would be maybe you can tell people watching, like, what made you want to write the article that you wrote on DZone? Well, first, I guess we should drop a link to the article in case anyone hasn't had a chance to read it. And there it is. And yeah, what made you want to write it? And then maybe go into a little bit about like your central thesis.
Sure. First off, I got to preface it by saying anything in there or anything I say is not reflective of DZone. It's not reflective of the company I work for. That's all on me. So any of that is just my personal opinion. As far as what got me to write it, I know it's not my normal type of article. Usually a more technical or Java-based type of articles. But I think the idea of censorship and freedom of speech has gotten a lot more traction now, because I think in the past there was kind of a little more abstract. It was a little more of a philosophical argument whether or not you'd be able to speak your mind. But nowadays, I think just kind of living in the last year, I think it's become a lot more real for a lot more people, and a lot more people are seeing how much of an impact software specifically has on speech, and how much of an impact, they coined the term big tech, but how much the major software companies impact the free flow of speech and what can be said online.
Right. So like basically the platforms that are giving people the ability to get speech to a broader audience probably brought about the dialogue, the discourse that we're talking about today. Because before, it's like, what were your avenues for reaching this, as many people at the same time? They weren't really the same. So I guess that makes sense. So can you walk us through like the central argument or central thesis of what you wrote?
Sure. I mean, the first, like, I went to go write an article defending free speech, and then it kind of crossed my mind that I just assumed that free speech was a good thing. So I had to step back before I wrote that article and kind of walk backwards and say, okay, one, is free speech a good thing? I can't just take it for granted that free speech is a good thing. So a couple things I looked at were, if there's pluses and minuses to being able to speak your mind freely. In a case like we have going on right now with the coronavirus, just as an example, if you speak about something, let's say that's a treatment and it's a non-viable treatment, and it can cause damage to people, there's a case to be made that you should restrict speech like that, because you can cause damage to people if they take a certain drug, or if they, ingest a certain medication and it's not, clinically proven, that could cause issues. Reverse of that, if, let's say, somebody espouses a certain type of medication that is actually helpful, but you go on a platform and they say you can't speak about that, the downside is now the people that could have been benefited by that can't, because you can't get that information out. So there are definitely good arguments to both sides of it. To me, the central point of why I personally think free speech is a good thing is because in order for you to restrict somebody else's speech, you kind of have to assume you know better than them off the bat. And to do that, there's no real case to be made for that, because if you make a case that, let's say, it's a matter of how well educated you are, or any type of identity or intersectionality, the next question that usually come up is, okay, what gave you the authority to make that the criteria for picking whether or not speech should be valid or not? And so you just go
Right.
on this infinite path of where does your authority come from? Let's say if you say something, Kellet, and I say he shouldn't be able to say that, and I shut it down, the authority in the end just comes down to I think I'm right and I think he's wrong, and I think he's so severely wrong that I should limit his speech.
So then so I think if I read your article correctly, then what you're saying is you think that in the instances where we see either people being deplatformed or we see accounts being banned or speech being removed, that comes. I think the term used is moral relativism. It comes from a place of like, well, somebody, in order to make that decision, someone has to believe they are morally superior, or they have there's a basis for making that decision that has, is rooted in some person or some group of people's sense of what is right or wrong.
Right, right. So like I think I'd mentioned in there, there's a couple different types of arguments that get made. One is something like if you and I debate back and forth whether or not barbecue or pizza is better if we were going to go out to grab food, right? Yeah, there's going to be difference of opinions on that, but is it really so severe that you and I are like not talk to each other again because you wanted one and I wanted the other? Usually it's kind of understood that that's not something important enough to make a distinction on. Then on the other side of it, stuff that we just all agree upon, right? Let's say something
Right.
like murder is a bad thing, stealing is a bad thing. Those are things that are just universally true. There's not really much debate about that because if you took a survey of random people throughout the world, we have like a shockingly similar definition of murder, a shockingly similar definition of stealing. The stuff that really gets contentious is the stuff in the middle that's, let's say, something I take as a core belief and I think that's objective, and I disagree with you on that, and you are just as adamant about your opinion on that as I am. And that's where stuff starts to get contentious. And that's usually where, let's say, religion or politics lie in. It's kind of your worldview, and a lot of people differ on how they view that. And that's where a lot of times people get this. I don't want to say that it's like self-endowed moral authority, but it's essentially it's I believe so deeply about this topic and I'm so secure in my beliefs that let's say you disagree with me, I know you must be wrong and you're so
Right.
wrong that I should be able to say, okay, that's just completely incorrect. Like you shouldn't be even able to say that.
Right. And so it comes down to like, yeah, I think ultimately that comes down to identity and like what you take to be true. But and it makes sense. Like religion would be one of those places where, religion is belief in a truth that people who say believe in God think it's an objective truth that God is real, whereas people who don't uh, think the opposite. So like, I think it does bring up the case of like, I mean, in that extreme example where if we're talking about limiting speech around religion, for instance, would walk the line of, it would be in one of those gray areas, but I think we all agree that people should be able to freely express their beliefs, their religious beliefs. So I think that's an example where protected speech is assumed to be like people should be able to say these things, but then there are some other gray areas where it gets like it's. I don't want to throw any specific examples where maybe it's not so historically rooted in people's beliefs or something. It's something a little more subjective, where I think where a lot of the contention happens. But even probably around religious topics. Do you? So I do think it's important in the conversation to talk about what the definition of free speech, the definition of free speech versus protected speech, and like I think you talked about it some in your article, but can you talk some about when we're talking about freedom of speech and the death of freedom of speech, like the article says, what are we talking about?
Right. And I think that's that's usually where a lot of people get wrapped around the axle, is that we're all coming from a different definition of what free speech is.
Yep.
So, and the way I defined it in the article is that there's basically, for the most part, any speech goes with certain reasonable restrictions on it. So if you go on Twitter and you threaten somebody with death or bodily harm, I think that's a reasonable place where basically except for one or two people, you're probably going to get everyone to go, okay, that's not something that we should be curating and, allowing to continue, because that's something where you go from saying something and speaking your opinion to actually calling for physical violence on somebody, right? There's a threshold that we cross there that's a reasonable restriction. Now, where the line gets really gray is that I think that reasonable restriction is starting to slide a little bit into, there's a conflation between somebody stating their opinion and somebody causing harm. So
Right.
nowadays, the idea of causing harm gets stretched a little bit into, if I say something that really challenges your core beliefs, yeah, that could be causing harm to you, right? It can keep you up at night, keep you really thinking about something, or vice versa, right? But that's a different type of harm than causing physically or bodily harm or threatening to do that. So free, I guess to sum it up, I'm not a free speech absolutist in the sense that you should be able to say anything you want, no restriction. I would say I tend to be more on the side of just about anything goes, except for certain reasonable restrictions, and that's where I think most of the debate happens, is where those reasonable restrictions come in.
So would you say maybe free speech is any type of speech that doesn't impede on the freedom of another person?
Yes, I mean that's a very good way of putting it. Now, the unfortunate part is even saying that gets to an argument. Like, I was using the word harm before, but that's just as debatable about what things restrict other people's freedom, right? Like, people are making cases that are pretty. Uh, I guess some cases are better than others. Some take mental gymnastics. Some are a little more reasonable.
Yep. Yeah, well, I mean, I think you get into the realm of emotional freedom versus physical freedom versus, but I think ultimately, the question, the thing that I think we're examining here is where's the line, or the thing that we should be talking about is like, where is that line? I think you have to know what the line is first, that can't be crossed if there is one, and then if that line is definable, which is, I think, like you said, a lot of the contention comes from like the definition of what is free speech. And so if we can define what that means, which I think legally we can, the question becomes next, like, what do you do with that information? And how do you use that to govern what people can and can't do on the internet specifically?
Right, and I think that's, like, you mentioned that there's a legal definition of it, and that's a good, I guess, the strict like threshold to define. The hard part is now, as you go into the world of the internet and you go into the world of the software companies, you're now dealing with companies that aren't government entities per se. They're not.
Right.
They're started by a private entity. They're owned by a private entity. And I think I mentioned in the article, there's a case to be made that dividing lines becoming smaller and smaller, and we could probably touch on it later, but things like Section 230 and things about how corporations now have gotten so large that they have no choice basically but to form a relationship with a lot of different governments around the world. And how do you abide by laws where somebody says something in the United States that's legal, but you go to a foreign country and that same thing is not legal? How do they deal with that kind of stuff? But now you're not dealing with governments per se, you're dealing with private companies, and the restrictions you put on these companies, it gets into to my personal opinion, it's going to get into a bad area if we start adding in laws that restrict what these companies can say. But on the flip side of that, that doesn't mean that just because you can restrict anything you want as a private company, you should do that. I think that's where the argument kind of goes awry, is that people focus so much on the legal, well, these companies can say and do whatever they want when it comes to restricting and censoring, but that doesn't mean they should be doing it, right? There's a very big difference between can and should.
And what do you think? Well, there's a couple questions that come to mind for me. The first one is like, what do you think the motivation of a YouTube or a Twitter or a Facebook is when it comes to determining what can and can't be said on their platforms?
Right. Now, I can't speak for them as a organization, but I can say that there is more than one that usually flow into there. I mean, we like to umbrella them as like big tech or YouTube or all these different companies, but in the end of the day, they're just people. Whether it's the software engineers programming things or it's the executives running the company, they're all people, and that means they come with all the same ups and downs that people have, all the benefits and brokenness that people have.
Right.
So, from a company point of view, there's certain things like these, if they're
Oh, am I still on? I thought I was frozen. It looks like Justin's frozen. All right. Well, so we'll see if we can get Justin back. This is the downside of all this remote live streaming. Um, I'm sure he'll jump off and jump back on. Oh, he's back.
to get
Can you hear
interrupted
me?
there. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Good. I don't know where we were. So we were talking about the motivations, of any type of. And I think when we talk about big tech, we're talking mostly about just ubiquitous platforms that like millions of people use as communication mediums. I would
right,
assume.
right. And I think probably the final thought on that idea was that the people have personal biases, right? Whether that's the people programming things, the people at the top, and those personal biases do factor in. I mean, we're human beings. We all, just like we talked about before, we have things that we believe to be objectively true, and that's why
Right.
even the article, I don't discount that people when they censor because they have, let's say, a political bias or a religious bias or whatever that type of bias is, are doing it for malicious reasons. They think they're doing the right thing. Right? If you strongly believe that person X, Y, and Z is espousing something evil, you almost have a moral implication to, or a moral impetus to actually stop that speech, right? You think it's evil. So there's a human part that factors into why certain things are banned and other things aren't banned.
Right. And so you're advocating for trying to remove as much of that the human element of that as possible, or the innate biases of humans in making those types of decisions, particularly when people are using um, like platform software to speak.
Right. And it's kind of hard because at some point, like I said, all these companies come down to just human beings, right?
Right.
The most effective way I could think of to remove that bias is remove the need for it. And to remove the need for it would be to just let as much speech through as possible. Because the human bias comes in when you start picking what to moderate or how to moderate it, right? When there's just free flow, again, with that reasonable level of restriction, the lack of moderation is where the lack of bias comes in. So you allow people to just see as much information as they can, and then you're going to have to at some point let them make their own decision on how they interpret that information.
Yeah. So I think that brings up an interesting point. Is like what is can censorship, or not even, I wouldn't call it censorship, well maybe I would, but can removal of certain types of speech be seen as a way to protect people from themselves in a sense? And is it so should we be allowing people to engage their own critical thinking? And that's kind of at the root of what you're saying.
Yes, and so to answer your question strictly by the letter of the law, yes, it actually is a way to keep them from harming themselves. But the issue with that is it comes back to the original idea of free speech. One, am I correct in banning that speech? Because I may be wrong, and there may be
Right.
consequences to me not allowing people to see certain things. And two, at some point, you can't basically play nanny to people. You do have to let them make their own decisions, whether or not you think it's harmful to them or you think that the information coming through could be used to harm. Like we talked about the COVID example, you
Yep.
know, if you tell them to take medication X and you think that's a bad idea, that person's going to have to make a determination: is medication X actually going to harm me, or is this a good thing? Because there are going to be differences of opinions on that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So there is a different question. I don't know if you actually brought this up too much in your article, but on those lines, like let's say we did move to a model where every type of platform was just an open forum. Anybody can say whatever they want. With the few restrictions, like anything that's threatening physical violence or threatening or impeding on people's freedoms. These platforms do two things. They allow people to communicate, but they also amplify certain types of speech. They amplify people. They act as ways to get people's ideas into the minds and eyeballs and ears of other people. And so there are algorithms behind who sees what when. And like, would you tease out, like, if I'm a big platform, or let's say I invent a big platform and I allow anybody to post, do you think there's an equal kind of weight of responsibility to amplify voices equally on your platform?
Yeah, that does get into a difficult spot because that's also another place where bias comes in, right?
Yeah.
Um, if you just naturally like let things go without any type of amplification, without any type of essentially monkeying with the system, you're going to have usually the voices that are most either disagreed with a lot of times get amplified because a lot of people start to focus on it because they disagree with it so much, or the things that people want to see usually get the most like organic amplification.
Like confirmation bias.
Right. So usually a lot of times you can probably tell now if you watch any type of like headlines and stuff, usually it's the things that either people already believed and said, okay, this is backing up what I've already believed, and I'm going to use it as ammo for if I debate somebody, or the opposite,
Right.
when you see something that's you completely disagree with or that's completely nuts and it gets you kind of hot-headed. That's usually something that gets a little more organic amplification. When it comes to these companies doing amplification, that kind of goes to the moderation part. It's kind of the opposite side of that same coin. There gets into an issue where your personal biases come in and say, I never stopped that person from speaking, but I basically reduced their audience to zero, and essentially they were yelling in an echo chamber, or they're yelling in
Right.
a room with no one in it.
Right. Yeah. So it just brings up the question in my mind, like, if you have I think at some level a moral obligation. I think the argument is you have a moral obligation to allow speech, or maybe it's not a moral obligation, because I think that may not be what you're saying. But you have, the idea is that speech should be allowed, and the merit of speech should be what creates amplification for that speech, right? Or
Yeah,
yeah, I
and
think the
that's
merit of yeah.
I would say that's kind of hard to keep tabs on because that's something that's a lot more organic, right? There's things that might be amplified that I don't agree with, and there's things that might be that no one catches on to that I do agree with, right? That's a hard thing to. At the core of it, you still want. Essentially, there's a want of control over what speech gets out there and what speech gets popular.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. But I mean, if you think about it, like I think you made an important distinction earlier of like any platform, the platforms that most people use, they are private entities, or they're publicly owned, but private entities, publicly traded private entities. And um, the the goal of a publicly owned private entity is to generate returns for its shareholders. That is the reason an entity like that exists. So I think to ignore that as a huge driving factor in all of the forces that we're talking about at play here kind of leaves out a big part of the conversation. So when I look at like a certain platform deciding to remove a voice from it, I can't help but think that is a calculated risk to remove to remove risk of being prosecuted for hosting that, but also to remove turning off users who might not like that, what they see on the platform.
Right, and I agree with that. There's a, like I spoke about before, there's a responsibility that they have essentially, and this is like in the most layman terms, they have responsibility to make money for their shareholders, right?
Yep.
Now, they do have that responsibility. I think that there are times where sometimes the ideas or personal disagreements or personal biases do override that. And it's kind of hard to tell because essentially if you banned anybody right now that's got some sort of clout, somebody would be upset with it. And
Sure.
I think it's kind of hard to tell because some of the bannings that have happened from a financial point of view wouldn't make sense. And they generate a lot more negative press than they would positive press. So somebody banning a certain celebrity or somebody banning a certain figure, you would think would cause a lot more negative side to it, cause boycotts, certain things like that. People migrate off the platform, and it's kind of hard to pinpoint without. Like, I don't see their balance sheets, and I'm not sitting in that boardroom knowing what's going through their head. But you would think, based just off of what the response would be, that for the most part it was negative, and there wasn't much positive to be gained by it. That sounds like something else is factoring into that removal or that action.
Well, there is an old adage that says any press is good press.
That's true.
And also, I think it comes down to, I think I commented this in the article, but I think it comes down to, if I would think if you're a multi-billion dollar service that has millions and millions of users, that you know exactly who are your most valuable users. And so to me, I wonder if there are if that weighs into like who may or may not be deplatformed or even just like kind of, I wouldn't say muted, but yeah, de-amplified, because maybe you're taking a risk of losing some users, but they don't fall into that like coveted highest value group, which a lot of times is probably going to be the more mainstream group on the platform.
Right, and I agree with that. I'm sure they have a pretty good tap on what their demographics are and what their user base is, and essentially they can tap in pretty well. We mentioned in the article about kind of guessing at what people's beliefs are based on their posts and based on their likes and their shares. You can get a good idea of what the most common thought process is on the platform.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that I have an overwhelming sense that is one of the key the motivating factors. I mean, you're talking about an entity that exists to create profit. And I think in the United States, we take that as like a sacred thing too. Like, existing in a capitalist society to create profit is, why it's why we work. It's why we, a lot of people believe it's why we live. We live to be capitalists, right? And so, like, at least from a United States point of reference, it's morally correct to try to seek maximum profits. And but I do think I think that's probably the main driving factor in a lot of these decisions, unless you have like a rogue executive or like figurehead executive who has reached a certain level of like the platform has reached a certain level of ubiquity that it doesn't really matter. It's always going to make money. It's going to make a lot of money. And now it's about, using the power of that platform to make morally guide society. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not a CEO of a huge company like that, so I don't know if that weighs into it or not.
Right.
But
And I mentioned in the article, I think somewhere towards the middle of the article, I would agree that that fiduciary responsibility factors into it. I would say that that's probably one of the factors. And
right.
I guess my difference in opinion on that comes from what those executives have said themselves and
Mm-hmm.
different things that they mention about why they, to take a specific example, after January 6th, why Parler was removed or deplatformed, based off the executive's own words, it kind of does. I think there is a factoring in of, well, we could remove a competitor. I think that definitely factors in. That's a financial decision, and we can argue for days about whether or not companies who are competitors should have a stake in, you know,
Each other.
right, squelching a competitor, and how that factors in legally. But besides that point, that their statements on that specific deplatforming kind of sound like there's a financial aspect to it, and it also sounds like a personal. They almost made a moral case that this platform was doing something immoral, and they decided that it was a good idea not to support what they considered immoral.
Right. Man, I think we lost Justin again. Give him a couple minutes. It looks like we got some good comments going on right now. Appreciate everybody tuning in to look, to watch. G-Square, thanks for your comments. Need sample code. Thank you. Great discussion. Lauren. Hello, Lauren. I want to get into. Oh, we're back. We're back, Justin. When we get Justin back, I want to get into we're going to start to talk about what is. Oh, video's back. No, what do we do? What's the path forward here? And then the implications for software developers. I think that's an important thing that we wanted to touch on because that's who we're talking to right now. We'll give Justin just a minute. Let me check on him. Sorry for everybody watching or if you just tuned in. We're just having a little technical difficulty. I'll have Justin back on in just a second. Start coding for freedom. That's all right. Thanks, Jesse, for that comment. If you guys haven't had a chance yet, I think Blake should have dropped the link to Justin's original article in the chat, so check that out. Hey, oh, he's back.
There we go.
How's it going?
We'll just chalk that to me not saying the right thing, right?
Yeah, well, I think Blake probably deplatformed you. That was a temporary suspension, so just watch what you say moving forward. Yeah,
right.
You get 3 strikes. So that's probably a good pivot to say, like, I think there were a couple other things we wanted to talk about, but one of the things I definitely wanted to touch on was, so what does this all mean for people for software developers who are working on these platforms or working on any type of platform where people are disseminating information, and like, what is the role of the individual software developer in that, and what kinds of things should they be thinking about, or can they think about or do?
Right. So we're in a kind of unique position as software developers and just people living in 2021. Because years ago, if you want to censor somebody, you should be through news media, or when radio became a thing, you could censor radio waves. It's the censorship now is almost systematic in a way that it couldn't be in the past. And I don't mean systematic as an institutional systematic. I mean it
Yep.
in if I type certain letters onto a platform, they can ban it without ever a human being ever interacting with it. Right. So it's almost an algorithmic type of censorship than it was where a a censor in the past, like, I mean, a good example would be like in 1984, where you have um, characters sitting at desks, literally looking through newspaper articles and trying to ban certain articles and clipping them out. There had to be a human being doing the banning. In this case, you just have, in a sense,
A
you know,
programmatic approach.
right. So you have something where I type certain letters, I like certain things, I share certain things. You can now, without a human being moderating that, you can basically be banned off the platform automatically.
But
And
that
that,
still has to be programmed by an individual first.
right, correct. So that's where the this our position as software engineers becomes a little bit different, is because it's no longer you're being hired as a censor. That line has kind of been blurred. Now if you're doing software or creating software for a company, and you're working on a program like this, or you're working on this algorithm, you're not, essentially your job is to create software, right? And there's not really a
Yep.
title that says I'm hiring you as a censor, and this is kind of goes along with your job title. Now it's just an average programmer who you have to make a decision when you come to writing this program. Is this something I feel morally okay with? Is this something I agree with? Is this something I disagree with? And a lot of times as programmers or as software engineers, there's kind of this understanding that we're we're hired because we're individuals that program, not because we're just people that type on a keyboard and write code, right?
Yep.
So a lot of times the best software engineers you'll meet are people who are just pretty well rounded as people, where they have an ability to critically think, they have an ability to communicate well, and all these different aspects that go into being a good software engineer, not just being able to, this guy codes the best and he just, whatever I tell him to do, he does. So
Right.
we kind of have an obligation when we do different types of, or we write different types of programs, or work on different types of applications, to think about what we're doing and say, do I agree with this? Do I not agree with it? And that kind of goes down a road of, if you don't agree with it, what do you do if you don't agree with it?
Right. And so I guess, yeah, there, I think it'd be easy as a software developer to chalk up any work as like, well, I'm just implementing the requirements I was given.
Right.
I'm just building I was given the instructions and I'm building it. Um,
Right. It's essentially, it's the old Nuremberg excuse, right? Like I was told to do X and I did X, and I have no idea where that goes and where it flows up the chain, but I was instructed to do it, so I did it.
so do you think a good software engineer has a responsibility to be aware of, at least at a high level, what they're building and what it's being used for, um, and what the implications of what they're creating are, or like what are the implications of what they're creating? And
Yeah,
that's a person. I'm asking you a personal question because I think people have different views on that, obviously.
right. So yes, I would say they do have an obligation to, essentially, what I consider, to think about what you're doing and think about what
Hmm.
the implications are of what you're doing. There's a caveat to that, and that's, a lot of times, some of these systems are so large you don't know the full extent of what your piece is doing in that system. So if you're working on a one component of 10,000, it's kind of hard sometimes to see the big picture. But I
Yep.
think the easier question to answer is, when you do know that you're in that type of environment and you do understand that maybe this is not something I agree with, there's a couple options. One, the most straightforward one, is to remove yourself from that situation, whether that's to quit or move on to a different job or whatnot. But I think there's a better argument to be made for not doing that, because if you do just straight quit and you say, I can't think of myself morally doing this, you lose your ability to influence the situation, right? You've just, essentially, the only people that would be left at that point are people who agree with it, and it's just going to continue.
Right.
So personally, to me,
So
the
by
better
doing
option.
nothing, you're doing something.
Right. I mean, the old throwing proverbs out here. There's old things that if you decide to do nothing, you still decided, right? It's not
Yeah.
like you now just are completely removed from that situation. That thing is still occurring, or that thing you disagree with is still happening. You just have no influence on it anymore. Um, I mean, at some point, if it gets bad enough that you may have to quit, like there's a point where there's no longer influencing the situation, and you just need to remove yourself from it. But for most cases, I don't think it's gotten that far yet. So the best thing you could do is you have a position at that company and you have some influence. They hired you for some reason. They consider your work valuable to some extent. You can make it known that, maybe you or a group of people who are working on this don't agree with where this is going. And now you have a position of influence, whether that's small or large, depending on, your seniority in the group, that you can influence and affect how things work inside that company.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. And uh, I think uh, software engineers generally probably have more influence than they even like to think. So I think it's important to at least embrace that, and understand that there is. I mean, no matter the scenario, whether it's on the topic we're talking about now or it's something else you see, you're working on that you don't agree with, I think there's always an opportunity to influence it, and you know, but there may be cases where there's not, and I think that's where you get to the point where it's time to remove yourself.
Right.
And so, what do you think the path forward is? What do you think the path forward is in the world to make because this is a really kind of like a complex topic. There's a lot of factors at play. How would you like to see things moving forward?
Right. So personally, to me, I don't think we've fully made the case that free speech, as the way we defined it here, like the way you and I were talking about it, is actually a good thing. I think we're kind of one step too far down the road when we talk about how we're going to increase freedom of speech or how we're going to preserve it. I think
Hmm.
that culturally right now there's a pretty large debate going over whether or not that type of free speech is a good thing. Because now, if you look at polls that people take, whether it's you know polls of people over 60, under 60, and different demographics, there's a higher move towards restricting speech that's considered harmful in the sense that it challenges your sensibilities. That it again, I guess I defined it before as the speech that keeps you up at night, right? The stuff that really makes you
Right.
think. I think culturally we're shifting more towards a society where that type of speech isn't considered, I completely disagree with you, but I will fight for your right to say it, right? We don't cherish that value as much. So I think the first step is for us to make an argument that freedom of speech in that sense is still important and it's still something that we should be tending towards. It's something that, these companies should have, even if it's not I'm not talking legal obligation, but a should, like a moral obligation to say,
A
hey,
social obligation.
right, you can ban this speech if you so decide, but I'm not going to because that's not the right thing to do.
Right. So morally, that's what you believe.
Correct. Yeah. So I think that's where we're kind of jumping the shark here, is that a lot of times we're talking about how do we preserve freedom of speech with these companies. I think there needs to be more of a discussion, a debate about freedom of speech itself being a good thing.
Yeah, and examining what's free speech really is, and why it's that way. Yeah, I
Right.
totally agree. And that I'm sure you could get some really people much smarter than both of us talking about that for days on end
Absolutely.
in a conference. So, um, I do, being mindful of time. I know we've got a few people watching that might have some points or some questions. So I wanted to make sure that they get a chance to. I know, like, we could talk about this all day and go down a bunch of different rabbit holes. Um, but I definitely want to give anybody watching a chance to ask Justin questions, or provide a comment. So if you're watching right now and you want to drop something in the chat, please do. And hopefully we'll get a couple questions here. I did see some activity in the chat earlier. War topics, yeah. War topics. If you want hear a take on a topic, a related topic. Hopefully, we're willing to talk about it too. We'll give it a minute. Oh, thank you. Sweet. Got some call out comments here.
Okay, so I could definitely feel that one. So the question is, while this is true, having mass spread of misinformation can lead to physical movement/violence. While there needs to be freedom, at the same time there needs to be a form of policing, and I think that goes to what you and I were talking about towards the beginning, Kellet, that there is a reasonable level of restriction on free speech, right? If you're, God forbid somebody called for the harm of you directly and said something like that on a platform, that needs to be one removed because it can incite, let's say, like doxing now is unfortunately become a big thing where if that information stays up on that platform, other people can use your address or your personal information to target you. Something like that should be brought down, and the person who made that post should be prosecuted for basically making a threat on a bodily threat. I think the hard part is that when we say policing, it's a good umbrella term, but it gets kind of sticky when you try to define what policing is, right? So you say on these platforms they have moderators or they have fact checkers. All those moderators and all those fact checkers come in with their own personal bias, and it all boils down to, at the end, a human being determining that this other human being is correct and this other one's not, right? So the idea of policing, we kind of have this like almost utopian idea that there's some sort of unbiased arbiter that's going to say, okay, this person's correct, this person's not, and there just doesn't exist that. So it's a lot harder to come up with what that policing strategy should be.
Yeah, I also think it's challenging when you talk about misinformation that can lead to violence. It's not always like a direct connection, so it's probably hard to identify what misinformation over time will distill into something that makes somebody act violently. And I think, it could be a very simple idea that takes root and then people twist it and turn it. And it could be something that is a direct call for violence. And I think obviously if it's direct call for violence, that's a pretty clear cut case. But if it's 2 or 3 steps away from that, that's where it gets tricky for a human being to interpret, I think, and to predict kind of the effect of it.
Right. And I think there's also like we were talking about before, societally, when it comes to defining free speech and us having an issue with even saying that free speech is a good thing, that there's also, unfortunately, a kind of a fracture of what people think is reasonable today. I think that's what goes to what you were saying about what do you define as a bodily threat or bodily harm. The idea of being reasonable about that is kind of fractured a little bit.
So Jesse says, Justin, would you like to become a counter corporate coder?
I don't know if I can't say there's going to be like a league of counter corporate coders. I think it starts, my personal opinion, it starts at individuals, right? Like you don't necessarily have to band together to do this, but each person that writes code, each person that's a software engineer has influence where they are, right? So sometimes we have a tendency to want to group up because it kind of feels more secure to be in a group of people, but it doesn't always have to be, a group of software engineers banding together and saying, we're going to make a second agile manifesto, except this is for freedom of speech. Right? It could be you're the only person in your office that disagrees with this, and it could be a 12 angry men scenario where you're the person that's now responsible for the uphill battle of swaying people's opinions or making a case that people haven't heard before. Right? So I agree that I'm sure with larger groups, there's going to be probably, if there's enough people that have this idea of freedom of speech being a good thing, you'll probably see groups of people banding together because there's going to be power in numbers. But for most software engineers, it could be at a small company, it could be at a large company. You basically have to exercise your influence in your sphere of influence, and that might be different from company to company and even groups within companies.
Right. Oh, Ali Reza making an appearance. Hey, Ali Reza. Thanks for your question. Let's see. What is your suggestion for developers to become more confident about the knowledge that they have? I'll
That's
let you
kind of,
answer that one too.
yeah, that's kind of a tough one because it's basically asking how do you become confident about what you know is right, and I think um, that's a tough question to answer. I guess the way you, if you're sure about what you believe, and at some point there's going to be a threshold that you cross and say this is important enough for me to step up and say something. That's kind of your essentially. I would say know really well what you believe and challenge what you believe because people are going to challenge you. If you say, I think banning this statement on this platform is a bad idea, there's challenges that come up. You could just look at the comment section on the article, right? It's not a universal
Hmm.
given that people are going to agree with this. Um, so you really have to challenge yourself and look up the arguments that other people have against what you're saying, right? Look at the most prominent arguments against free speech and really understand them. Find what in them does this make sense? Do you understand it to the point of view of the person who's making it? Do you understand as well as the people who are countering your argument? And once you do that, you kind of settle in on, okay, I really believe this and I'm confident in what I believe because I understand where they're coming from. I disagree with them still. And I think that's the part of really getting a solid foundation. And then from there, there's going to come a point where, something's minor and you're like, this isn't worth me, ruffling feathers over. If you ruffle feathers over everything, then nothing's going to be a big deal. But there is going to be a point you're going to cross that, this is a big enough deal that I need to take my solid understanding and say, okay, I need to step up and say something.
And Ray, hello, Ray. He says, in my experience in traveling the world, strong debate on many topics is accepted and engaging. I say this to draw out that perceptions on this topic is regional. So I think if I'm interpreting that correctly, what you're saying is, depending on where you go, they might have different opinions about what you shouldn't be able to say. But it sounds like most people, you in your experience, most people feel like open debate is important. And we got to think of the internet as an international thing. It's a global thing. It's not a U.S. centric thing. And I think that's one of the things that I think a trap that's easy to fall into is like because most of the companies running these platforms are in the U.S. and because maybe the initial user base is in the U.S. or a large swath of it is, and obviously we're in the U.S. That our perspective on this is the only perspective, and I think that's important to note here. Um, it could be in a different environment in the world that speech plays a different role in that culture and society, and being mindful of that I think that just complicates the entire topic even more, particularly for those platforms that are global platforms and that they have people like you mentioned earlier. There's thousands of different laws that they probably have to abide by and stuff. So it's super interesting to think about how do you come up with a global standard that suits everybody. Oh, Lauren, thank you. I think Justin froze again, but we're getting close to wrapping up anyway. So I kind of heard you.
Oh, okay. I think it froze there. I
There
was
you
just
are.
saying, one last thought on what Ray was saying. It's kind of interesting to see how much people agree about stuff you would assume people disagree about. Like we talked about murder and stealing being a universally bad thing, and you would think that if you go around the world, you'd find different ideas of that same, what is murder, and people disagree about that. But it's kind of, I mean, it's a whole topic unto itself, but it's kind of crazy that you go to different places around the world and it's not as relative as you think it would be. And it's kind of interesting to see from your experience that people's idea of speaking freely is one of those things that seems to be like a universal thing with people, no matter where you come from and different cultures and stuff.
Yeah, sorry. I was I think I froze there for a second. Yeah, I agree. I think human beings are interesting. That's for sure. And we have a lot more in common than we don't. And I think that's
Yeah.
certainly something to consider. Um, even in a discussion like this, where we're talking about the things that are different between us that cause conflict, I think ultimately we all want the same thing. It's like health, happiness, and prosperity. And Lauren is making a plug for Social Dilemma. So if you haven't seen it, definitely watch it. And
I
then
actually haven't seen it, so I can't make a comment. But Lauren, will definitely put that on the watch list.
and I watched it, but I can't. It was a while back, but I can't remember. But I think it was about the algorithm, the role of algorithms, and kind of like maybe not indoctrinating people, but influencing people's psychology. And I think on that note, G Squared said, as more and more psychologists get involved with ML and building models tailored towards thought, what balance do you think we should follow?
Ooh. I mean, that's from a technical side. Stuff like that usually gets me all worried because we really are like very unaware of what we don't know. And like just to give an example of how this usually goes kind of awry is things that were banned on these platforms a year ago are spoken about today openly. And now they're factual, even though if you said it, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it would get you banned. We almost have this understanding that like we're right at any given time, and we kind of forget how fallible we are as people, and that we don't always get it right. So like it does worry me when a lot of times they introduce, well, people think this way, therefore we're going to train the model or tailor the model to look this way. They don't allow much room for being wrong, and they don't allow much room for past mistakes and being wrong and not understanding that I could feel completely confident about something right now, and I could be completely wrong. And a year from now, it's going to look pretty silly that I even thought that, but more information comes along, my understanding of things change. So I'm always a little hesitant to say when they train models that are going to algorithmically deny things or algorithmically, you know, tailor speech a certain way, that essentially you're going to start squelching the voices that would have made you aware that you're wrong. All those voices that would have bubbled up to the surface and come to find out, hey, this is something that's actually true, are going to go away, and you may not now find out that those things were true.
Yep. So yeah, I would agree. I think the ML is in particular a really tricky subject when it comes to influencing people and
Right.
how predictable people are versus how predictable we think they are. And
Right.
That's a scary topic for sure. There's massive potential for good and massive potential for harm, I think.
Right.
Jesse Friedman, I missed it. There's a difference between hate speech and speech that you hate. Yeah, thank you.
Keeping it short on
Exactly.
that one, I agree.
Alfred Pinto Molina, he says, please let the developers know what is the Milgram experiment. We may end up doing a lot of bad things if we don't have boundaries. So I'm not aware of the Milgram experiment. Do you know about the Milgram experiment?
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was I forgot what university did it. I think they had students from a university basically go into, they kind of split them up and convinced half the students that the other half was, doing something wrong or evil. Um, and essentially they allowed them what they thought they were inducing pain to like, correct their behavior. And over time, as they start to get this confirmation bias that these students were doing the wrong thing, they kept teaking the pain up a little bit. And it was kind of it was basically an upward spiral of the group convincing each other that like, you can do things that you wouldn't expect yourself to be able to do given the situation, and little steps and little incremental steps can push you in a direction that if you just stepped out of it, and by the end of the experiment, you're looking at these guys going, these were just average students, and all of a sudden they're perfectly fine with what they thought was inducing pain in other students. And if you stopped and just took a snapshot of that, you'd be like, how'd you get from average people to just what you'd consider like vile behavior, just progressively, little step by little step.
So it's
And I think,
similar to the Stanford prison experiment.
yeah, I actually, that's I'm not sure if that's the correct the same Milgram experiment. I'm not sure if he was the overseer of that, but that's what my understanding of it is, and that's I think he's right. Sometimes you're so far in the weeds that you don't step back and look at what you're doing and understand there's a bigger context to this, and there's a um, you know, if I looked at myself from 10,000 feet, what I'm doing right now, out of the situation I'm in, would this be something that I approve of?
Right. In humans, there are positive feedback loops that feed on each other, and then they grow kind of unnoticed, and then they expand exponentially in terms of human
Right.
behavior. That totally makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so we're over time. I want to be mindful of your time, Justin. Thank you for the article. It was an awesome article, thought provoking. I think lots of really awesome discussion on DZone. Lots of people read it. I think it's a worthy topic to discuss. I know we probably didn't do it justice today, just because there's in an hour, it's not much. You can't cover everything, so
Right.
perhaps we'll end up carrying this conversation on in different venues and formats and channels. I want to thank everybody who was here today, watching and giving your feedback and your questions. And Justin, I'll let you kind of sign us out if there's anything else you want to end on or say, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. And I guess on this topic, I know it sounds like something you would take for granted, but I don't take it for granted that you guys let us post things like this. That in a day and age where things are tending towards, we don't want to touch controversial topics, or we don't want to step on toes, that you guys are giving me a platform where I can say stuff like this, even if there's disagreements with my editors or there's disagreements with DZone as an organization. You guys are still comfortable with letting things go through that are, you guys may have personal disagreements or personal agreements with.
Yeah, no, and I think the good thing about the DZone community is I think it's full of a lot of critical thinkers, and I could tell from the comments on your article that there was a lot of constructive conversation happening, and thanks in part to you, because I think you treated each comment thoughtfully. But generally, I'd say, I think the goal of I think the goal of posting what you posted was to get people to talk about it thoughtfully. So, and I hope that in a way they were able to do that on DZone. But I think the conversation goes well beyond DZone. So.
Right.
Just thanks for sharing it, and I'm glad that there are other people who found it interesting and worth talking about.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, for coming, and I think you put a link in here if anybody wants to watch. Go back and listen to other parts. You can go on YouTube, and we will share it out later on as well. So thanks, Justin. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Kellet.
See ya.